Hey everybody, so just jumping right into this week's discussion for the content. The first question that was posted on Canvas was, in what structural and institutional ways do domination and oppression manifest in differences? So kind of the first thing that I thought about when I read this question was the idea of privilege groups, and this is coming from the Johnson reading. So just kind of the idea that privilege groups are set up as the standard for comparison, and like the other group is below the standard. So this is kind of an example from this reading specifically was how whites are embodied racially as the standard of comparison, and that all other people of color are like considered the other. And no matter what culture, no matter what group they're from, they're kind of just lumped together as people of color, and they're considered the other. So the second question that was posed on Canvas was, how are systems of injustice both structural and individual? So when I first thought about this question, I think that the first thing that came to mind was things like colonization, capitalism, violence, and stuff like that, slavery, and this was really talked about in the Smith reading. So something that I thought that was interesting in that reading was the conversation about slavery and the social hierarchy within slavery still today. So how, like, within the social hierarchy, blacks are at the very bottom, and then all other people of color kind of like operate within the rest of the social hierarchy. So something that was like shocking in this reading was how it said that as long as you're not black, then you have like the ability to escape the commodification of capitalism. So that's kind of how I answered that part of the question. But on the other hand, I think when you're thinking about individual injustice, I think that it's important to think about like a person's background and kind of where they come from and their personal experiences and how they're viewed in society. And so something to kind of back this up was from the textbook reading, and in that reading I think that really like sheds a lot of light on personal experience of someone who holds an intersectional identity. So in that reading, the author was talking a lot about like violence that he has endured. And so a quote that I pulled out that I thought was really interesting was the quote, I think it was in chapter 2, and it says, expressions of masculinity would assign me hard-earned respect and protection. So I think that this just kind of embodies the idea that a person's like experiences like reflect also the injustices that they have faced. So those are kind of like my two insights for those two questions, and then my third insight actually comes from the videos that we had this week. So the video that really stuck out to me was the one was where all of the people were like grading themselves based on how much privilege they had. And so just kind of like looking at the people, you would think that some of them would have more privilege than the others, and then they started revealing their cultural background, or if they are part of the LGBTQ community, or like what class they belong to, or like how they grew up. So I thought that was interesting, and something that I really thought about while watching that video is how privilege is something that is like handed to you, and it's something that has been in place for a long time when it's handed to you, if you are someone who can access privilege. Something else that I thought about while watching that video is that people who do specifically come from intersectional identities have a hard time accessing privilege because it's not easily handed to them, but also that not all people from intersectional identities experience privilege the same way. And I think that that's really was embodied in the video about the Latinx privilege, and she was talking about how light-skinned people from the Latinx community access privilege differently. And when she was talking about that, I really thought about the term passing. So yeah, so just like to kind of recap, my first takeaway was coming from the first question that was posed on Canvas, and it was really focusing on privilege. The second insight that I had came from the second question that was from Canvas, and it was about structural injustice and how it links to things like colonization and slavery still today. And then also coming from that second question about individual injustice and how it's linked to a person's experience. Then the third insight that I had was coming from the videos, and about how different intersectional identities access privilege. So some of the questions that I had from this week, the first one I had was, how could we address and start conversations within education about Orientalism? Because I think that a lot of the times within education we do talk a little bit, starting now, about things like decolonialism, and so I think that introducing the term Orientalism could potentially start conversations about things that are really like pertaining to the American experience today. And the second question I have from this week's readings and content was, how do things like violence reinforce white supremacy and privilege? So that is kind of pretty much it for this week, but yeah, thank you.